That would be good. I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
To take up the member who's just received his seat's suggestion, I don't think it should be restricted to the committee. I believe that anyone who's made the effort to be here at 12 on a Wednesday morning deserves the right to be there, and I see Amy Adams is seconding that idea as well. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party is certainly supporting this bill, and I think it is worth noting that the area that we're talking about here does have World Heritage status, and New Zealand should be rightly proud, but also at the same time feel a sense of responsibility for ensuring that we continue to support the status of these very important parts of the planet. Mr Speaker, previous speakers have gone through in some detail the nature of the islands that we're talking about and the process that they've been through in terms of protection, initially for the land itself under the Reserves Act, and then carrying on through the Auckland Islands Territorial Sea becoming fully protected in 2003, and moving through various regulations to the point that we can reach now where these sets of islands will be protected. And Mr Speaker, as I say, on this side of the House we're strongly supportive of that process. What I wanted to focus my comments on in this first reading was around the way in which this legislation comes to the House. This is special legislation to create these marine reserves. We are not creating these reserves under the law that currently exists for the creation of marine reserves, the 1971 Marine Reserves Act. Now, a number of excellent things occurred in New Zealand in 1971. I was born, for instance, as one of those things. That's a moment that many people will note, I'm sure. Louise Upson was possibly born just a little before then, I think. Just that year, sorry. I thought it was the year before. I withdraw and apologise for that. Another 71 baby there as well. So 1971 was overall, on balance, a good year, although it's starting to waver a little, but overall it was a good year, and it was the year in which New Zealand passed its marine reserves legislation that put us at the forefront of marine protection in the world. This was legislation that was world-leading in terms of creating effectively no-take zones around our coastline. Other countries were well behind, and my colleague Phil Goff has already spoken about the damage that has been done in other jurisdictions by not having this kind of legislation. The issue that New Zealand now has, Mr Speaker, is that fast-forwarding 40-odd years, New Zealand is now actually falling behind in terms of the way that we go about marine protection. We are left with 40-year-old legislation that is in fact cumbersome, and it's been suggested that this is something that could have been done about 9 years, and I actually do accept that. I actually accept that in the last Labour government we did need to try and make progress on this, and to that end we had marine reserves legislation that sat on the books. The problem we had was, in these days of MMP and minority governments, getting a coalition of parties who would support that legislation. And I recall this very well because it was part of my working life at the time to try and find the support for that legislation, and members on the other side of the House who have such enthusiasm now for marine reserves may wish to reflect that they weren't in favour of that legislation, but neither, unfortunately, was a majority of the House. What that now means in 2012 is that we are left with legislation that is in fact hopelessly out of date and very inefficient. And for this bill, one of the considerations that officials had to have was whether or not this bill should be special legislation to create these marine reserves, or whether or not it should go through the Marine Reserves Act process. Well, what the regulatory impact statement on this bill tells us is that the average time to establish a marine reserve under the Marine Reserves Act is 12 years. Now, it's between 1 and 23 years, but 12 years is not a figure that anyone in this House can be proud of. We need to be able to establish marine reserves in a way that is a lot more efficient and a lot more comprehensive than that. So, Mr Speaker, I do think that it's time for this House to turn its attention back to the legislative framework for the establishment of marine reserves. The Environmental Defence Society have this year put out a publication around their views of what needs to happen in terms of marine reserves legislation. I had the honour of launching that earlier this year, and I tend to agree with them that the time has come not to return to the legislation that Labor had in front of the House 10 years ago, because time has passed that as well, but to create new marine reserves legislation that actually allows for the efficient promulgation of these kinds of reserves, that allows for the creation of a network of different types of marine protected areas, all the way from no-take areas through to the full protected reserves that most people would understand. We need to ensure that the purpose of any legislation that puts in place marine reserves is the protection of biodiversity. Because at the moment, that isn't completely clear, and it particularly isn't clear if you're creating no-take areas under the Fisheries Act, because that purpose is not even there. So having a focus on the protection of biodiversity, having the ability to create a range of instruments, having a network of marine reserves and protected areas is the kind of approach and framework that I would like to see us undertake. And I would hope that we could work across the House to find a way of developing that kind of legislation. It must not be as difficult as it is now to establish these kinds of reserves. And Mr. Speaker, alongside that, the other thing that New Zealand governments have been working on since the late 1990s is the establishment of some kind of integrated oceans policy in which marine reserves can sit. And there are some good models of this around New Zealand that we can look at. I'm thinking here about the spatial planning exercise in the Hauraki Gulf and elsewhere, where we can actually see integrated oceans management actually supporting the protection of biodiversity. So I do urge the House that we do need to return to this question of what new modern marine reserves legislation would look like, and ensure that we take on the very best practice around the world so that New Zealand once again can be a world leader in that area. And there is one specific aspect of this bill which I do think would feed into that, and my colleague Phil Goff has already mentioned the fact that the establishment of these marine reserves actually arose from a process called the Subantarctic Islands Marine Protection Planning Forum, and that was a piece of work that was begun under the previous government. It's based on the Marine Protected Areas policy from 2006. But the situation we have now is we have an excellent policy on marine protected areas and legislation that doesn't match up with that policy, which is why we need to make changes to allow MPAs and marine reserves and other types of protected areas to be included. But the process that was used in that planning forum is one that should be incorporated in any future legislation. That is a far more collaborative process that brings together stakeholders within a particular area and gives them the opportunity to be part of developing these models. I think there's an even better model, and that was the one that was used to develop the Fiordland marine area. That was a model that truly included all of those in the community who were interested in marine protection in Fiordland, including recreational fishers. Not that there are any recreational fishers in the Subantarctic Islands, but it included all of the stakeholders who would have wanted to have a say. It was quite a long process, but at the end of it there was universal buy-in and, Mr. Speaker, importantly, an ongoing role for that community in Fiordland in the continuing management of marine space. So as a result, Mr. Speaker, I think that there are some things in the way that these marine reserves were created that could find their way into future legislation. But what I wouldn't like to see, Mr. Speaker, is the need to continue ad hoc development of marine reserves. What we need is comprehensive legislation that facilitates the efficient creation of marine reserves based on the principles of the protection of biodiversity and enabling New Zealand to move beyond just our territorial waters out into the exclusive economic zone and protect the marine areas that are required in those spaces. The EEZ legislation that was passed through this government did not sufficiently take that into account and is going to limit New Zealand severely in being able to play the role that it should in protecting our marine areas. So, Mr. Speaker, we do endorse this bill. These islands are an important part of the World Heritage Network, and I hope that members of the House will take on board the importance of this kind of legislation and give New Zealanders a framework for establishing marine reserves that we can be proud of.
I call the honourable member Gareth Hughes.